All right, I think we're ready to continue. Hello, everyone. My name is Nadia Ivanova, and I'm a fellow at the SAIS Emerging Tech Initiative. It is my pleasure to introduce our third panel of the day, which will focus on how breakthrough technologies don't just transform industries, they reshape economies. Our panelists will discuss the economics of innovation, examining how emerging technologies like AI, biotech, and space are disrupting markets, redefining global competition, and influencing economic growth, from the rise of DeepSeek and AI-driven market shifts to the challenges of ensuring these technologies benefit developing nations. Panelists will discuss the opportunities and risks of commercialization. The panel will be moderated by Chenny Zheng to my right, who is a director at Cerberus Ventures. She was previously a principal at In-Q-Tel, the strategic investment firm supporting the missions of the Central Intelligence Agency and the broader intelligence community. Prior to In-Q-Tel, Chenny served as the China portfolio lead at the Pentagon's Defense Innovation Board, where she supported the AI Ethics Principles Project, 5G Report, and other initiatives. Before the DIB, Chenny was co-founder of an edtech software startup operating in Beijing, overseeing fundraising, product development, and technical support. Chenny was a 2020 Next Gen National Security Fellow at the Center for New American Security and a 2022 Emerging Leaders in Biosecurity Fellow at the Johns Hopkins Center for Health Security. She received an MA in International Economics with a minor in China Studies from the Johns Hopkins University. And it is my honor to introduce our panelists. Dr. Alison Perez is a senior investment manager at Lockheed Martin Ventures. Ali is responsible for investments in AI, data analytics, human potential, biotechnology, man-unmanned teaming, digital transformation, and advanced manufacturing in space. Her role also supports post-deal integration and transition of technology from the Ventures portfolio into Lockheed pursuits and programs. She runs the Ventures Internal Research and Development Program that provides Lockheed Martin engineers with opportunities to collaborate with startup companies that Lockheed Martin Ventures has invested in. Prior to joining Lockheed Martin Ventures, Ali ran large-scale research programs across Lockheed in AI, human-machine teaming, and biotechnology. Next to her is Chris Morales, who is a partner on the investment team at Point72 Ventures, leading defense tech investments. Prior to joining Point72 Ventures, Chris was a technology, media, telecommunications associate at Goldman Sachs in their investment banking division, where he advised leading technology clients on M&A, debt, and equity financing. Earlier, Chris served as an FA-18 Super Hornet weapons system officer in the US Navy, where he flew combat missions in support of Operations New Dawn and Enduring Freedom. During his last 2 years on active duty, he was assigned as a flight instructor responsible for teaching aircrew the techniques, tactics, and procedures of the FA-18. Next, we have Henry Farrell, who is the Stavros Niarchos Foundation Agora Institute Professor of International Affairs at SAIS. He was a 2019 winner of the Friedrich Schiedel Prize for Politics and Technology and editor-in-chief of the Monkey Cage blog at the Washington Post. He works on a variety of topics, including democracy, the politics of internet, and international and comparative political economy. He is author of Privacy and Power, the Transatlantic Fight over Freedom and Security, and the Political Economy of Trust, Interest, Institutions, and Interfirm Cooperation. Our last speaker of the day is Alex Poulin, who is a partner at Loverock Ventures at an early-stage venture capital firm based in Washington, D.C. Loverock invests in technologies at the forefront of data, AI, deep tech, and national security. Prior to joining Loverock, Alex was a manager at Deloitte Consulting, where he advised clients across the government, technology, and financial services sector. He holds an MBA from Georgetown University, where he focused on entrepreneurship and non-market strategy. I will now turn it to Chenny for what I'm sure will be a dynamic and insightful discussion. Thank you.
Great. All right, thanks, Nadia, for that great introduction. Before we start, just some logistics. We'll do about 30 minutes of discussion, and then we'll leave the last 20 or so minutes for Q&A. So if you have any questions, just be thinking about those questions. I'm really excited about this panel, the lab to market thing, because I think in this century we're living in, technology is influencing the way our world develops faster and more so than centuries in the past. And so this question of how technologies move from the lab into the market is a really important one to examine. And this panelist, this set of panelists, I think, is very exciting because we have perspectives not only from the strategic side of how technology is impacting global affairs, but also at the tactical level. We have VCs who are supporting the founders that are working on getting these technologies into the market. And not only the small startups, but also we have corporate VCs from like Lockheed Martin's perspective. I think there's a big role to play for the large behemoths companies to also get some of these innovative technologies into the market. So with that, I'll start at the 30,000 foot level. It would be great to just kind of go around, start high level. How do you see emerging technologies impacting the world as we see it, either from the lens of global competition or from the lens of how societies function? So Ali, we'll start with you.
Yeah, big question to start off with, yeah. So I see emerging technologies becoming a really key aspect, and it's always been a really critical function in our economy as, you know, the United States, but it's starting to become a more global affair with people picking up on the model of venture capital and the model of, you know, really integrating small businesses so that they can scale to large businesses. And, you know, I think the representative from Google earlier, he was mentioning, you know, how there is this disruptive ecosystem that's coming to play where the big behemoths can't really disrupt themselves. They need to learn how to integrate these new and emerging markets and technologies into their ecosystem in order to succeed. So I think it's starting to become this really big player in and of itself, like the conglomerate of, you know, small players all starting to work together and row in the same direction.
Jenny, thank you so much, and thank you so much for having me here. So at Point 72, we largely invest in defense technology that we think will shift the balance between superpowers and any sort of global stage. There's two that come to mind that we've made a substantial amount of investments in, or two specific fields rather. That's AI and space. So for an example, AI, you know, Josh listed a whole bunch of great examples about how we use it in day-to-day lives, but in a military context, functionally what it does is it closes the OODA loop substantially faster, right? Whether that is AI-enabled software, whether that's autonomy, it just allows for faster decision-making in the battlefield. And just has been the case since the OODA loop was conceived in the mid-20th century, the side that is able to close the OODA loop fastest is likely the side that will come out ahead. On the space side, we're seeing some interesting dynamics. So we know the cost of launch is coming down. What maybe is not as obvious is the cost of actually building satellites is coming down as well. We have a company that will allow you to put a satellite, absent the payload, but the core satellite bus for about $4 million. What's interesting is if the cost of launch comes down, if the access to space goes up, and the cost of building things in space goes down, you have a bunch of interesting applications. You have space-based solar, data centers. You have countries potentially acquiring their own sovereign space capabilities who previously couldn't have afforded it. And it creates an interesting dynamic that we can see has an impact across not only the space domain, but other technology areas as well.
Okay, so I'm a professor rather than a venture capitalist. So the ways in which I think about this really have something to do with what Thomas said in the last panel, which is I think that we are in for a lot of big social upheavals, and we've barely begun to think about what the political consequences of those might be. Even if you're skeptical, here I'm thinking in particular about AI, if you're skeptical, even if you're skeptical about the about the idea that we're going to get to AGI, and I'm extremely skeptical about it, we see how it is that large models can be used for a variety of organizational tasks, for really translating between different kinds of knowledge, summarizing various forms of knowledge, which means that a lot of people in big organizations such as the Pentagon are going to find themselves effectively, their jobs, I think, are going to become defunct over the next few years. That's going to be true of a lot of other organizations. We really need to start thinking about what the political and social consequences of this might likely be, what kinds of upheavals it's going to cause, and maybe try to get ahead of this as much as we possibly can.
Yeah, I think, to echo my fellow panelists, we look at this kind of new emerging technology landscape in a couple different factors. I think obviously, the advancements in AI have really changed the global competition landscape, right? Both from a public sector perspective and the private sector, right? So not just talking about the kind of government and political aspects and, what does society look like with the integration of these technologies, but from a function perspective, how does this impact someone's daily lives? What does it matter? We like to ask the questions. We as a venture capitalist, we see tons of new innovative companies, but and most of them will not, ultimately be large successes. But the question we like to ask ourselves is, what happens if this does work? What happens if this technology does come to fruition? How does that impact society, both from a business perspective and a kind of quality of life perspective? And I think, we're really at the point now where we're seeing a lot of that change really, really fast. So it's trying to stay ahead, try to keep up with the pace, and kind of understand there's large-scale impacts.
Just stay on that. So we do see a lot of innovative companies that have big impact. Maybe just go around the room for the investor side. Can you describe your process or your framework for how you pick certain companies and how you balance the impact a potential technology could have versus maybe some of the financial metrics you're trying to hit? I think this will be interesting to hear because, Ali, you're from a corporate ventures perspective, and we have two more traditional VCs. I'll just start from my former life as InQtel, or more of a nonprofit strategic investor. So I think the impact sometimes outweighs the financial outcome. So while we do invest in companies that were commercially viable, sometimes we may make a bet on a company that we think could have an outsized impact in terms of like national security, or just say that broadly, when the financial outcome may not be as big as we think it could be. So just be curious in how you guys evaluate and pick companies.
So from a corporate venture capital perspective, it's a little bit of a double-edged sword. We have it kind of easy because we have a very clear mandate for the kind of companies we invest in. So for us in particular, we are looking for dual-use technologies, meaning they have a defense application and a commercial market and are particularly relevant to enhancing the platforms that Lockheed Martin builds. And so for us, what we invest in goes across the 14 different technology domains that are all listed in the National Defense Strategy. I think most people are familiar with those. For us, those also have to be relevant to the Lockheed Martin products and platforms that we put out. And so it narrows our scope enough for us to say we're interested in technologies that are enhancing, that are not necessarily competitive, but complementary, and things that are going to help us leapfrog some of the R&D that we're already putting into certain spaces like hypersonics, advanced materials, AI. And so for us, when we're evaluating a company, we're looking at, can this company solve a particular pain point, not only for our government customers and for Lockheed, but also really propel the entire field forward? So
we tend to look at which technology could shift the balance of power between superpowers. And that's because we think that if you're selling into the DoD, particularly as a startup, it needs to be an urgent problem set. Otherwise, the glass isn't going to get shattered, the red tape isn't going to get cut, and it's going to take forever to scale. So for companies, which if you're a venture investor, you're looking to scale quickly, whether it's defense, whether it's commercial, whether it's different sector, that sense of urgency and that impact of the technology, if it works, has to be critical. The next thing we ask ourselves is this the right team to take it forward? So within the national security context, I would argue it is very difficult to build a business if you've never worked in the national security sector before. We think somewhere on the team there needs to be a previous service member, a previous DoD or IC civilian, someone who worked in the commercial sector but sold into government, someone who understands policy, because it's very difficult to tackle the sector, at least for now, if you're an outsider. Last, we're looking for really impactful technology, and typically that's delivered by people who are the best technologists in the world at whatever particular field they have. Maybe it's the person who architected a very complex network for Palantir. Maybe it's the person who built Anduril's C2 node. Maybe it's a expert professor in ground or aerial autonomy. These are all concrete examples of folks in our portfolio that have gone on to build technology for the warfighter. And we think pairing that together in a fantastic team, along with an area of increased urgency, is ultimately what leads to scaled businesses being able to deliver capabilities to those on the front lines.
So rounding out the venture capital perspective, so we're Lavrock is focused on early stage technologies, right? So every investor is going to have a slightly different answer to kind of what they look for and kind of what proof points and traction and kind of validation they need in order to make an investment. So us being at the early stage, generally we're not working with a ton of information on the company itself. The company might be only a year old, or sometimes less, right? They might be kind of starting, in the same month you're looking at investing. So generally, I think Chris hit on a couple great points in terms of what we get comfort around in order to make that decision, and the team for us is kind of number one, right? So understanding, the founder market fit. Is this founder someone that we believe is going to be credible in these markets, that has the experience, the track record that can ultimately execute? Usually investing as early as we do, the company's strategy and thesis they set out to solve likely is going to evolve over time. So they're going to need to pivot, right? So even if the idea itself is sound and the founder, is credible in that space, can they evolve and grow with the business? These are all things that we try to evaluate. And in some levels, you're not going to get complete certainty over it, but understanding that they're the right ones to kind of figure that out and make those decisions, that's a key part of it. And then the second piece I'll say is, again, though, if they bring this to market, if they create this technology, is anyone going to buy it, right? Because, in order for venture backed companies to go raise large rounds and ultimately get to an exit event, you have to continually show these progressions and proof points, and usually in the form of both product development but also revenue. So if you have really cool tech and no one buys it, then it doesn't really make a difference. So trying to understand what that buyer landscape is like is another really important aspect to our investment analysis.
Henry, can I redirect it back to you and maybe zoom in a little bit? You mentioned some of the things that we should be cognizant of in terms of AI and the impact in the world. Can you talk a little bit more about maybe the one or two things that you think policymakers or even private investors should pay attention to the most?
Sure. Well, if you're thinking about the policy problems, I think that the big policy problems do have to do with the fact that if this actually works out, a lot of people are not going to be employed anymore. And we really need to think about how to manage those kinds of changes in the economy. If I think about this from the point of view of a venture capital person, obviously I am not a venture capital person. One of the great things about being a professor is that you do not have to have any ventures more complicated than thinking about how in the name of God am I going to get my syllabus together for class. But sort of as a complete outsider, it seems to me that a lot of the possible opportunities that we're going to see over the next few years may not fit super well with the traditional venture capital models. So if we see, and here again I'm thinking about AI and large models, if the kinds of arguments we see about AGI and creating moats and sort of superhuman intelligence, if these don't work out, I think that there are going to be a ton of opportunities to apply AI and large models in the workplace, but these are going to be for very boring things that aren't necessarily going to scale up super well. So I do wonder if there are opportunities for non-venture capital type money to get in for opportunities to do things which make the world, make organizations work better, but don't necessarily have the kind of the likelihood of having a unicorn sort of suddenly burst out sort of with horn and sort of shiny whatever, that might be a space where we might want to think about what are the practical, mundane, boring, non-super high-scale things that are getting missed out on if we just look for things that scale quickly, scale well, have that opportunity of actually going big.
And in terms of policies, are you thinking funding for research or more regulation? Or can you talk a little bit about how you're thinking about that?
So I think that there are a bunch, and this maybe gets beyond the theme of the panel, so forgive me if I am jumping off a little bit, but myself and a couple of colleagues had a piece in Science a couple of weeks ago where we made the argument that I'm laying out here. And one of the implications of that argument, I think, is that if you look at the way that US policy around technology has really been based on the bet that AGI is going to happen real soon in the next few years, and then you begin to think, well, that could happen. So there are a lot of people who are claiming that it will. There's also, I think, 84% of AI researchers in a recent Nature poll suggested that they thought that was not going to happen. So I think we want to think more generally about what kinds of policy decisions we want to make for a world in which that big bet doesn't necessarily pay out. Do you want to put your eggs all in that particular basket? Are there things, for example, that China is doing and here material technologies I think are super duper important. All of these questions, which I think to some extent get sort of overshadowed. Equally, as this is not the theme of the panel, as I'm the odd person out here as a non-venture capital person, I don't want to hijack the themes of what is, I think, a really interesting conversation that is developing.
Well, I do think government does have a big role to play in terms of like getting from lab to market, at least on the biotech side. A lot of the early R&D work is too risky for at least a venture capitalist to put money in. So a lot of our companies that we invest in, they've probably taken up to like 10 million or around there in non-dilutive funding grants from government, either from HHS, BARDA, all these folks, before we actually put money in. So I think there's definitely a role to play for government. And then even on like the later stage, on the manufacturing side of biotech, that's pretty CapEx heavy. Like you have to build steel in the ground. And I do think that's another area where government can play. And I've seen at least DoD and others have tried to like talk through what that could look like.
Well, one question, if I could just very quickly respond, is how does this work in a world in which a lot of that basic science, sort of the non-profitable stuff, government seems to be getting out of the business of funding in the way that it used to be? And so it will be really interesting for me, at least, to understand how this actually affects the world of VC if a lot of those basic things are not happening in the way that they used to anymore.
Yeah, great question. I mean, it's made me a lot stressed because I think a lot of we depend on all these university labs, even like government funded labs, to do a lot of the R&D, because when it's that early, it's hard to tell what the commercial application is. It's more about developing the science. So it actually takes sometimes a decade for at least the biotech side to kind of figure out, is there even a company around here? But you want that science to be developed in that time. So for us, I think the kind of the cuts to the R&D side is definitely not great for biotech innovation, especially for biotech. US has been the leader in innovation. I know the UK and others, or China, especially on the implementation side, is great, but in terms of innovation, it still has been centralized in the US. But anyway, Chris, curious for you, do you think AGI is happening anytime soon, since you are focused on the AI side?
So I'm going to pass on making any sort of prediction on AGI, but I will say that we don't necessarily underwrite to it happening at any point in the near future. I will say that one thing we think about in investing in defense in particular is a concept that is a little bit different than I think more commercial side investments, in that it's not just about the technology, but it's also about the trust with the customer, how much the customer trusts the organization. Now, this has a lot of not so great manifestations or difficult manifestations. That's the facilities clearance process, that's the ATO, that's sort of past prior performance, and that's all the process that's been put in the acquisition system. But fundamentally, what that's all about is about trust in an organization. And for better or worse, if someone comes along with great technology tomorrow, if you don't know if you can trust that person, they won't necessarily be scaled within the defense sector. And so I think we think about this in the context not just about the core technology and the core capabilities, but also about building trust with the customer.
Great. Pivot a little bit towards actually commercializing the technologies. For maybe pick an area, AI space or whatever it is most relevant for you, can you talk about the hardest challenges in getting a company who has a prototype, maybe has a product, but still trying to figure out product market fit, and just actually sell to customers and scale that? What has been some of the maybe the big 1-2 challenges in those companies as you're working with these founders?
Yeah, so I'm happy to kind of take the advanced materials if nobody else wants it. So I do a lot of investing in biotech and advanced materials, and for Lockheed, biotech does mean advanced materials, right? We don't touch healthcare with a 10-foot pole. Understandably, nobody wants their defense contractor in their healthcare. So really, the biggest challenges we see for companies in this space trying to commercialize and get through the process of certifying a material, that whether it's bio-derived or not, is you have to go through these cycles of testing it at scale, especially the scale that is needed for a defense contractor, which may not be the same scale that you need for, say, like a 3M customer that's making mass quantities. For us, low throughput is the game, but they still have to scale it enough for the needs that we use it for. And then on top of that, you have all of the certification processes that you have to go through with, say, if you wanted to be on the F-35, you have to go through the Joint Programs Office. If you're going to replace anything, that takes years. And then you have to do environmental studies to make sure that your manufacturing process isn't impacting the environment in which it's being made, so that, say you have a manufacturing company that's manufacturing materials, they're doing it to put on a government entity, government thing that they're buying. They make some sort of environmental impact. They say, oh, whoa, you can't sue us. That's a government problem, right? So there's all of these other certifications and stuff that you have to go through, and even knowing the process in and of itself is a hurdle, I think, for a lot of these startup companies, is knowing even where to start, because you just don't know what you don't know. And I find that, applies not only for materials, even though it's like particularly relevant there. I find that also applies to some of the defense platforms, which I'm sure you guys can speak to, just not even knowing how to get certified for, say, a drone or UUV or whatever it may be.
I'll say the thing that might not be obvious to people on the outside with a lot of these defense tech companies getting started is, I think there's a common sort of ethos that Silicon Valley entrepreneurs are now coming to defense. And while that's true, a lot of what's actually happening is folks who are in the national security community, who previously served or were civilian, as I mentioned before, saw a problem in their jobs. And much like similar stories that have been written in the commercial sector, they then start a company to fix the problem they saw. And many times, not often, but many, they will first have to convince the end user that they can do what they say. Because much of the end user, much of the requirements officer, or much of the sort of establishment's mind and experience has been with other providers who have sometimes struggled to sort of live up to the appropriate expectations, or the requirements for a given program were written in terms of what technology was mature 5 years ago, which means it was developed 10 years ago. And so I'll give you a great example. We have a company in the ground autonomy space, Overland AI, and there's stuff on the Army's roadmap that the Army has scheduled to 2035, and they can do what is on that roadmap in 2035 today, but because sort of that roadmap's been developed and it's curated over time, it's sort of hard to change that roadmap and float the technology that's possible today when it's in fact based on what was built 10 years ago. And so I think oftentimes just convincing the powers that be that you can do what you say and that you can deliver capability today or at some point in the near future can be very challenging.
Yeah, I think understanding that timing is a key part to commercializing tech, especially that's coming out of these labs that are kind of heavy R&D. We work closely with groups like the national labs like Los Alamos and Sandia, and some of these technologies take years to foster before they get to a point where someone's actually using the product as it's designed, right? So as venture investors, and ultimately, from a customer perspective, if they can understand that the path that technology is going to need to take in order for it to get to a point where it's ready to be used, I think that's a key part of that. So as a founder, we talk to these folks that try to tell the story of, maybe it's not customer revenue that we're looking at, but like, what are those proof points? What is that validation you need in order to kind of, get interest of the customer, get interest of investors down the road? And what is that time horizon, right? Because we have investments in quantum space. These areas are all really long lead times for development. But as long as we can understand what happens in the time frame that makes sense to us, as investors, we have to make money and return money at some point. And so can't wait forever. So understanding what those timelines are, especially for kind of lab technology, is really important.
Can you guys talk about how market dynamics impact, I guess, like the development of technologies? I'll just give an example on the biotech side. Just markets have been bad in the last couple of years. There's been a lot more investor pullback. So technology companies that have even hit the milestones that they said they're going to hit have been struggling to finance their next round of funding, and that impacts their technology development roadmap. And I wouldn't say I would blame it all on the company. It's a lot on the market. Just investors are being more conservative and more risk averse. So I've definitely seen that impact on the biotech side, but curious if that's impacted space or AI, or you've seen. I don't think it's impacted AI, but curious from you guys if you've seen any impact there.
Yeah, I think it's been particularly difficult for companies to raise right now. So we have portfolio companies who have great tech, but if they are too early or, maybe haven't hit the technical milestones, or even are in the wrong arena, right? It's really hard for semiconductor companies to raise right now. I think there are particular sectors that it's more difficult than others, but it's just a hard arena right now.
Yeah, I would say biotech for any like industrial, like chemicals or stuff like that has been tough. Chris, I don't know.
Yeah, I'd say I agree that I think different sectors are experiencing things differently. I think what we've seen with space and many of like the core defense tech aspects is actually that the private markets have a very different reality than the public markets do right now. And so there's a lot of uncertainty in the public markets. The situation is rapidly developing. And it's kind of difficult to see exactly where things will wind up just based on a variety of different factors. But in the private markets, at least for the like a select group of startups, it's actually so far relatively active.
Yeah, I mean, just from as an example, from the fact that timing's everything. We made an investment in a company doing advanced computer vision for driverless cars like 8 years ago. Right, and a ton of other investors made investments in this area, and it was an area that 15 years ago was supposed to be here in 5 years. So that's an example of a ton of investors made bets in this area, thinking this was going to be a massive market and kind of the driverless autonomy sector, and it's proven to be obviously incredibly difficult. And now I think we're starting to see Waymo's doing a really good job. Obviously Tesla's making a play. So it's there, but if you don't time it right, I mean, the company still did fine, but in terms of kind of venture scale, there's been a ton of companies that got into that space, flooded the market, and just because the tech wasn't ready and the market wasn't ready for that top technology yet, they weren't able to succeed.
Cool. We're just about time, so I have one more question, then we'll open up for Q&A. Maybe we'll start with Henry, but is there a specific technology out there that you are most excited about? Not scary, but very excited about.
Okay, I'm going to change the question a little bit. There's a book that I'm actually pretty excited about in light of what Alison and Chris were talking about, which I'd really recommend is the most interesting book I've read in the last few years on government and technology. It's Jen Pahlka's Recoding America. And really what she talks about are the ways in which government processes of thinking about technology tend to have this waterfall process of, so as was just mentioned, you try to figure out 10 years in advance what the roadmap is going to be. If it fits, fantastic. If not, then you've got to figure out how to chop off the pieces and sort of add on whatever. And so she talks about the ways in which government needs to be much, much more flexible and offers some practical ways of thinking about how you can redesign government technology procurement in order to make it more capable of adapting to a world in which things change. So if I were to think about, and I guess it is a kind of a technology, is that trying to rebuild the technology of government so that it fits the world of technology that we have around us, I think is an extraordinary important task. And getting that right, if you do manage to get that right, means that a lot of other things could flow from that.
You go ahead. Yeah.
Henry, that's pretty fascinating. So I'm going to go with it. No, I'm kidding. I would say biomanufacturing is probably the thing that I am most excited about right now. So we, all kind of felt the supply chain crunch during COVID. Now we're grappling with the fact that, we have tariffs to deal with and we have all these geopolitical kind of upheavals. And so figuring out how to rehome manufacturing or at least nearshore it is really fascinating. And to do it from bio-derived materials, I think is one way that you can hit a lot of different checkboxes on things that we're searching for. And so it's a really cool time, especially when you can, say revamp like an old brewery or distillery or something for a fermentation plant, or, go like do these brownfield builds for stuff that just hasn't been functional for a while.
I was very excited when I remember it was a few years ago, Lululemon had launched their bio-made shirts. I think they discontinued it because of the cost issue, but I was very excited that we were starting to make shirts out of bacteria. Anyway, Chris, I'll go to you.
I don't know if I can follow that one up with anything great. So bio-made shirts, that's my answer. So everything we're talking about here needs one important ingredient, which is energy. And it is an ingredient that is increasingly becoming scarce. If you look at all the permitted for energy projects throughout the United States, and then you look at the projected demand for energy, you'll notice a substantial deficit. That is a tailwind that I think regardless of the macro is not going away anytime soon. And so one thing we're particularly interested in is enabling infrastructure for energy. That's new sources of energy, that is nuclear, that's ways of enabling nuclear. And then if you think about it, not only in the commercial context, but strictly in the defense context, you have a logistics picture that is complicated by transporting tremendous amounts of fuel. And anybody who's had time in the service knows that if you can simplify your logistics picture, let's say by transporting less fuel and generating more on the edge or leveraging resources at the edge, you wind yourself up with a much more survivable force. So an area we're excited about and are excited to continue investing in.
I think energy is a great one. I think that's also an area that we're excited about. I think if I would add another area that I'm kind of personally digging into lately, it's more in the AI, not as it relates to kind of agents and software, but software-defined hardware. So how does AI, these advancements, impact the hardware systems, both the government perspective, from a defense perspective, but also the commercial world, right? So not just in terms of autonomous cars and things that we see on the streets, but how does AI affect route optimization or the operations of a business? Things that people were trying to manage these systems before, and obviously software and LLMs have been in place for a while, but the advances of AI as they affect physical systems is an area that is going to touch many industries.
Awesome, thank you. We'll open up to questions now. I see a few hands up there. That gentleman over there had his hand up first.
Thanks. First off, I just want to say I'm disappointed no one mentioned flying cars. We've been waiting a while for that, so maybe the fighter pilot. In all seriousness, picking up what Dr. Farrell said about the impact on workforces, I'm curious, in looking at market readiness from lab to market, do you look at, at what state are the workforces of your customers ready for AI to deploy the technology? Like, what training is needed? Can they even make use of these new technologies as private companies, or let's say in the military? Is the warfighter ready to use these tools that will get them better information to, what does that look like, in particular as you're modeling the marketability of this? And then I'll end with, and are there lessons there for what we need to think about to scale at society level to answer what Dr. Farrell was saying about the disruption that's coming?
Chris, I feel like you have some thoughts around this.
Yeah, I will. I'll say that one thing that I think is important to remember is the age of the average sort of recruit or service member. It's in the early 20s or late teens, right? And so these folks are actually well ahead in the technology curve from where you or I are. They're well ahead of where we were at their age, because they're growing up in a native world. The folks that are going to boot camp now have had ChatGPT for 2 years, right? They've been making memes on different platforms, right? So they're native to this world. So I don't really worry about the workforce being able to adopt that. What I do worry about, though, is the data infrastructure and the core sort of plumbing and the ability to operationalize it across the force. The state of compute, the state of DoD IT, and sort of the state of DoD data makes it so that it is difficult to actually ingrain the technologies and integrate the technologies into the current force and the current services. And so one thing I think about, and one thing we do think about whenever we're making an investment, is how quickly and how effectively can company X, who's using AI, actually operationalize DoD data.
Yeah, I'm certainly not an expert in this area, but I think it's a great question. We see all the tools that we as a small firm use, but obviously large enterprises use these productivity tools all the time. And I think there's, as to Chris's point, there's varying levels of kind of knowledge and understanding of how to use these things, and the fact that like the pace of advancements is so fast. Like every other day, I feel like a new tool or new technology is coming out that could either take someone's job or make someone's life easier. And understanding how to navigate that, I think, is really hard. I mean, I've seen companies start that specialize in helping companies understand these changes, right? And like, I'm sure there's consulting firms, but half of them are just AI themselves, right? So it's a really interesting area, and I don't know how it's going to shake out yet, but it's certainly something to think about.
So to speak to your point about adoption and who's ready for what types of adoption, I think the commercial sector is a little bit more willing to adopt new and disruptive technologies. If you consider kind of defense primes separate and apart from the commercial sector, which I personally do, we're a little less eager, I would say, but we still are coming around to the fact that we are going to need to integrate the latest and greatest technologies. Where we run into bottlenecks is selling those capabilities to a government customer, because it's not the end user that's not excited about it. The end user is excited about it. The problem is getting it through the bureaucracy into the hands of those who actually can use it in a way that makes the powers that be comfortable. And so for that, you need validation and verification. You need to sell through a mechanism in which there is some sort of oversight and control. And I just don't think we've necessarily figured out the best path forward through that, although people are trying and people are actively getting it into demonstrations. And so I think there is appetite there. For how that disrupts workforce, I think there is always going to be shifting dynamics in what types of workforce we need. So when machining and machines came along for manufacturing, it wasn't a guy with a hammer that was needed in the manufacturing floor anymore, but it was a guy running the machine. And so even with automated machines, even with kind of a ability to have one person operate multiple machines, you're still going to need certain people in the loop. And so I feel less concerned necessarily about workforce disruption than I do workforce retraining. That's probably where the focus should be.
Great. Professor Griffiths.
Hello? Okay, it's working. Oh, it's fine. Well, go ahead, yeah. Okay. Kind of taking the low-hanging fruit here on tariffs. They're undoubtedly going to have an impact on U.S. manufacturing and U.S. supply chains. How do you see kind of the global landscape of emerging tech development changing? And are there any countries you see that might kind of leverage this moment to pull themselves ahead? Probably discounting China on that one.
Go ahead, Ali.
I think all the hesitancy is, making future predictions about anything is dicey stuff. I will say this: tariffs are going to change the landscape. And so it might be a springboard for some countries to pull themselves ahead. It might be one way to kind of rehome supply chain. It's just going to change the dynamics in a lot of different ways that are all unknowable. Tariffs in general are just particularly hard to predict their impacts. And so the very unsatisfying answer I'm going to give you is we'll see.
To the question of will tariffs impact? Definitely yes. I mean, even last week we had a conversation with a company that we were looking at. They had picked a site in Canada to, I would say, develop a material that we definitely need in our battery supply chain. The tariffs cut their margins completely. So they can't just pivot and pick another site, because to pick a site, it takes years of getting the permits for the site, getting the workforce in that area, the unions on board. There's a lot of planning in general when you're talking about building a big factory that takes years of development. So they can't just pivot their site. What they are going to do is sell those materials more to the Europeans. I think China is kind of out of the question because it's a material that China already develops a ton of. So the impact there is U.S. doesn't get access to some of those materials, but the Europeans will. So there's definitely an impact there. I think for tariffs, it's hard to predict the future because I feel like, things could roll back and go forward in the next few months. So, but there's definitely an impact on even the startup level.
Yeah, I think every company with a hardware component is sort of looking at their where exactly their supply chain is coming from, and even if it were in a Western country before, like, does it make sense to do something else and trying to really assess the impact there?
Thank you so much for this far-ranging and very insightful panel. I want to take us to the lab component. So there's the lab to market, and you've talked a lot about identifying various solutions that could potentially become applications or marketable. But the inverse of that is sort of communicating to people in raw research, innovative lab environments like those at JHU, but also across the board national laboratories, some of the kind of application use spaces that are out there. Because there's a lot of incredible innovation that happens. I'm thinking material science around semiconductors that just isn't something that could be used, even though the raw impetus of it is incredibly helpful because it's not scalable. You couldn't put it into current supply chains, or it's solving on one particular use case portion, but the resources that would go into it are just too high. So how do you sort of invert the question here, which is how do you find those technology moments and then push them out to market? And how do we better communicate and leverage that base of raw innovation to start to kind of innovate on things that have more potential to be pushed out to market?
So I can speak from a CVC perspective here. We leverage our network very heavily, and there are supply chain crunches that happen where we're well behind the curve and it's a little bit of a scramble, but we're trying to get ahead of that. So Lockheed Martin in particular, and I think all the defense primes are going through what I would call a supply chain illumination, where we're not just looking at tier 1, tier 2 suppliers of where are they? Are they going into obsolescence? Are they a mom and pop shop that's closing up soon? We're going all the way down to base materials of, is there redundancy in our supply chain so that we can still build the things that we can build? One of the, this actually just happened. One of our suppliers of rayon, of all things, decided, hey, it is not economically efficient for us to produce this anymore, and we are going to close up shop. And so there was a scramble to go out to the universities saying, can you do bio-derived rayon? Can you do rayon production in the US? Because the only manufacturers we know of are either in China or Germany, of all places. And so a lot of times it ends up as kind of a fire drill, but we're trying to fix that, understanding when companies are the sole source for us in any one given material. Additionally, we're trying to understand when companies are going into what we call obsolescence, where they are making something that is no longer going to be a part of our platforms or can no longer be certified by a certain date. So, for example, PFAS is one of those big issues right now, right? And trying to create alternative to forever chemicals is really tough because we need a certain level of hardening on platforms that are going, hypersonic speeds or, and so for us, it's, we're trying to work with universities and accelerators like an SOSV or the Engine or, whoever is in our ecosystem to really kind of push those, problems to solve. And one of the organizations that does a really, really good job of this is Hacking for Defense. And so while they are very policy focused, I think there is an opportunity there for the materials play to also send those signals out into the market and say, hey, universities, you have some PhD students graduating in this realm. Maybe you should encourage them to go take some of your IP and start a company.
Yeah, I'd echo that. Starting with the problem is key, right? If you have a solution, even if it's a breakthrough, if you're not able to commercialize it, or if there's no one pulling it out, it's a lot harder to just push your solution to areas that you may get a little bit of traction, but it's going to be hard to kind of sell that on a larger scale. Not physical sales and revenue, but just like sell the idea that this technology is useful, practical. We're kind of experimenting, and the government's certainly getting more open to this idea of like kind of reverse pitch, right? Like, here are the needs that we have. entrepreneurs go out and solve them, right? So like starting with the end problem and having people innovate and say there will be a market for you if you develop this tech. And I think that exists to some extent on the commercial sector too, but doing more of that, I think that will certainly help, innovate at the lab level.
I think we actually have a couple examples in our portfolio of success in pulling out lab technology. So 2 autonomy companies, I mentioned one Overland before, another one is Shield AI. Both of their technical work on the early side was largely done, or at least in part done, in university laboratories as well as DARPA. And why I think they were successful is that you had these core technologists who either had commercial tendencies themselves, or they were paired with commercial, i.e. business savvy founders that were able to then build a business around the technology, anchored on what Alex said, which is make sure you're solving a problem, not just pushing a solution. And then it was that team, again, is another point that I mentioned, which is the national security focused, commercial minded, great technologist, moving the technology forward, moving the ball forward, and ultimately delivering that capability to what is hopefully a large amount of folks.
All right, probably have time for 2 rapid questions. So there's one up front, and maybe we'll take 2 questions at the same time, and then we'll just have panelists answer. So one here and the gentleman in the back.
Just quick for the moderator and very quick for them. What is the plan B for Johns Hopkins University to support the basic research when we already know that the grants are not coming anytime soon, or maybe never? And for you guys, since when capital ventures support nonprofits? OpenAI is a nonprofit. Still, billions of dollars are pouring, and Elon Musk is threatening. Don't dare to convert to for-profit. So why venture capitalists go with nonprofits now?
Probably only have time for one question then, right? Okay. I think the first question was, what's the plan B for when the funding is, R&D funding is cut? I think it's too hard to say what the plan B right now is. I mean, for most of the companies we're investing in, we're assuming that the grants that they say they're going to receive or have been awarded for, we're just assuming that's not going to come in. So it's more of like readjusting our risk profile. So saying we thought 10 million was going to come in for this company, but really 0 is going to come in. So do we have to fund more, or is this company not a fit for us? So it's just adjusting how we evaluate the company. For companies already in the portfolio that we've already invested in, and they had expected 10 million to come in, and now maybe nothing's coming in, that's more of a conversation of where the trade-off. So are there specific things that you were going to develop based on that funding that you just will have to cut off for now or pause for now, and then focus on other areas that will generate some revenue that you can then put in towards that R&D later on? So yeah, that's my answer. But
I mean, I think you're exactly right. So for Lockheed, we will fund some basic research, but it really is very government focused. And so without the government pull there, it's hard for us to justify putting dollars towards that unless it's a critical capability that we're missing or is going obsolete, like I talked about. And so there might be some backup, but I think without the government funding towards basic research, it's going to be very difficult.
Nothing to add.
cool. Anything else from the other panelists?
Happily above my pay grade.
Cool. Awesome. All right. I think that's it for this panel, but thank you all for joining and for your thoughtful questions.
Thank you.